Air shows in Canada have been a popular and entertaining activity for well over 60 years. They're usually a family affair, a time to see the latest in new aircraft, a time to relive the history of aviation, or a time to relax and just enjoy the show. For whatever their reason for coming, the air show's popularity has grown immensely, with numerous major events being held throughout Canada each year. Back in the 1930s, aviation in Canada was still in its infancy, but nonetheless very popular with the public. In 1930, the R-100 drew over 600,000 people to Saint-Hubert near Montreal, eager to see the giant airship. At an air show in Kingston in 1932, the RCAF's largest aircraft, the Ford Trimotor, was a major attraction. But with the outbreak of World War II, air shows in Canada, as major summer attractions, came to an end for the duration. Even though air shows as popular entertainment events were put on hold, the war effort, and in particular the British Commonwealth Air Training Plan, provided much to see for the aircraft watcher in Canada. In Europe, the Supermarine Spitfire, the de Havilland Mosquito, and the Avro Lancaster were all becoming legends with their day-to-day exploits. During the 1940s, Canada saw a tremendous growth in its aircraft industry, and following the war, Avro aircraft emerged as a leader in aircraft design with the Avro jetliner's first flight in 1949. The 50s were the RCAF's golden age, and the return of the air show as a major event reinforced that fact. The CF-100 and F-86 Sabre were two popular attractions at air shows throughout the country. In 1959, the Golden Hawks were formed to celebrate the 50th anniversary of powered flight in Canada. But the Avro Aero's cancellation and senseless destruction ended the decade on a rather tragic note. Into the 60s, the Golden Hawks thrilled crowds across Canada with their superb formation flying. During Centennial Year in 1967, the RCAF's Golden Centenaires continued on in the Golden Hawks tradition of outstanding aerobatic displays. The 70s saw the formation of the Snowbirds, and they have continued to perform for over 20 years at air shows throughout Canada and the United States. In the 70s, the fascination with and the desire to preserve World War II aircraft grew and culminated with the formation of the Canadian Warplane Heritage Museum at Mount Hope in 1973. Their flying collection has grown considerably over the years, but their two most prized aircraft are the Avro Lancaster bomber and the Hawker Hurricane fighter. From the Canadian Warplane Heritage's home base at Mount Hope, the Hamilton International Air Show has grown to become Canada's finest World War II vintage aircraft show. Although the World War II planes usually dominate the show, the Hamilton Air Show features much, much more. Today, air shows are major events, taking the better part of a year to plan, involving hundreds of volunteers and drawing crowds of 40,000 to 100,000 people in a single day. For well over 60 years, air shows in Canada have entertained, thrilled, amused, and most importantly, educated Canadians about their aviation heritage, both past and present. This program is about that period in Canadian history and the air shows that starred Warbirds and more. In August 1930, a major aviation event took place with the arrival in Canada of the British airship, the R-100. She arrived at Saint-Hubert Airport near Montreal at 5 a.m. on August 1st, after a 79-hour flight from England. During its 13 days in Canada, well over 600,000 people came to see the R-100 at Saint-Hubert. On August 11th, before a crowd of 200,000, the 700-foot-long R-100 slowly withdrew from the mooring mast for a one-day tour of Montreal, Toronto, and Niagara Falls. She returned to England on August 13th. The trip to Canada for the R-100 had been highly successful, but 2 months later, her sister ship, the R-101's trip to India, ended in tragedy over France. At 2 a.m. on October the 4th, 1930, she crashed and burned near Paris, killing 46 of the 54 people on board. With that crash, Britain's interest in airships died, and the R-100 was scrapped a year later, in December of 1931. In 1932, the RCAF was far from being a large organization. It had less than 700 officers and men, and its fleet totaled only 183 aircraft, with 98 of these being trainers. But that year, at the Kingston Air Show, the RCAF made a major contribution to the show with their de Havilland 60 Moths, Siskins, and their largest aircraft, the Ford Trimotor. The de Havilland 60 Moth trainer was the most prominent aircraft in the RCAF's inventory at the time, numbering 56. In the early 1930s, Canada's front-line fighter force was made up of 9 Armstrong Whitworth Siskins. The Siskin biplane had a wingspan of 33 feet and a maximum speed of 156 miles per hour. Skydiving had not yet been invented, but parachute jumping proved to be a very popular attraction. The RCAF's one and only Ford Trimotor was acquired in 1929 for agricultural and forestry spray experiments, and served in those roles and also as a transport until 1937, when it was sold. As the 1930s grew to a close, war clouds were gathering in Europe. Then, on September 1st, 1939, Germany's invasion of Poland signaled the start of World War II. For the next 6 years, air shows, as Canadians had known them, were over. During the war on the home front, probably the single greatest Canadian contribution to the war effort was the training of air crews. This was done through the British Commonwealth Air Training Plan, which graduated over 131,000 air crew over its 5 years of operation. Very early on the morning of December 17th, 1939, 3 months after the outbreak of World War II, a group of government officials gathered in the office of Prime Minister Mackenzie King for the signing of the British Commonwealth Air Training Plan. Training under the plan began in April 1940, when No. 1 Initial Training School in Toronto received the first group of aircrew trainees. At the beginning of the plan, the de Havilland DH-82C Tiger Moth and the Fleet Finch biplane trainers were the main elementary flying aircraft. The Tiger Moth was designed as a military trainer, and the prototype first flew in October of 1931. It had a wingspan of 29 feet 4 inches and a top speed of 107 miles per hour. Prior to and during the war, well over 9,000 Tiger Moths were built, and of these, close to 1,800 were made in Canada. Both aircraft did their job well, but they were beginning to become obsolete. So in late 1941, the RCAF started looking for a replacement. A version of the Fairchild PT-19 was subsequently selected as the replacement trainer. It was known as the Cornell and the first were taken on strength with the RCAF in July 1942. By 1943, they had taken on most of the elementary flight training and continued in that job up to the end of the plan in 1945. After completing their elementary flight training, student pilots were transferred to service flying training schools. Those pilots with fighter pilot potential were posted to schools with Harvards, and those better suited towards bomber or transport operations moved on to schools with twin-engine aircraft such as the Anson. The Harvard is considered by many as one of the outstanding aircraft of the war. It proved to be the perfect trainer for fighter pilots, and there are few fighter pilots who did not receive their advanced training in one. The Harvard was the British Commonwealth version of North American's AT-6 Texan, and during the war over 2,800 Harvards were produced in Canada under license. It remained in service with the RCAF as a trainer until 1966. Students selected for the multi-engine aircraft were posted to one of the service flying schools which used twin-engine aircraft. At these schools, the Avro Anson was the most widely used, with over 2,800 built for the plan. Originally designed as a six-passenger commercial aircraft in the early 1930s, the Anson first entered military service with the RAF in 1936 as a reconnaissance aircraft with coastal command. With the outbreak of war in 1939, the Anson quickly became the backbone of the British Commonwealth Air Training Plan as a multi-engine trainer. In total, over 11,000 were built and served at training bases throughout England and all across Canada. In addition, over 800 airspeed Oxfords and 826 Cessna cranes were used in the multi-engine training role. At the peak of the British Commonwealth Air Training Plan, it was turning out over 3,000 graduates per month. But by the summer of 1944, the supply of new air crews began to exceed demand, and thus, at that point, training operations began to slow down. By the end of the plan, it had graduated a total of 131,553 air crews. Of that total, close to 50,000 were pilots, 30,000 observers and navigators, 15,000 air gunners, 2,000 flight engineers, and 700 naval air gunners. On March 31st, 1945, the plan was officially ended as the war was winding down. In addition to the training bases all across Canada, the RCAF had a large number of home defense squadrons. These were concentrated on the east and west coasts, with fighter and anti-submarine squadrons. The fighter squadrons were mainly equipped with Hawker Hurricanes and P-40 Kitty Hawks. The most active of the two home front organizations was Eastern Air Command in the Maritimes, which was responsible for protecting the Atlantic shipping lanes on the east coast. Throughout the war, German U-boats were a constant and serious threat to Atlantic convoys. Eastern Air Command was concerned with countering the submarine threat and with providing air-sea rescue. The major aircraft used in anti-submarine patrols were the Lockheed Hudson, the Douglas DB-1 Digby, the Consolidated Catalina and Canso, and the Consolidated B-24 Liberator. The Lockheed Hudson was a makeshift military aircraft developed for the RAF from the civilian Lockheed Model 14. As a bomber, it was not widely used, but for anti-submarine and convoy patrol duty, it proved to be a valuable interim aircraft before being replaced by the B-24 Liberator. During the war, RCAF crews flying Hudsons on the East Coast scored a number of U-boat kills and damaged many other in fighting over the Atlantic. The Douglas DB-1, or Digby, as it was dubbed by the RCAF, was based on the Douglas DC-2 airliner of the 1930s. Built as a bomber for the United States Army Air Corps, the B-18, as it was known, had become obsolete in that role by 1939. But as an anti-submarine patrol aircraft, the under-equipped RCAF were more than happy to receive 20 of them in 1939 from the U.S. under the Lend-Lease program. One Digby, flown by No. 10 Squadron out of Gander, Newfoundland, sank a German U-boat on October the 30th, 1942. After being replaced by the B-24s, they continued on as transport aircraft with the RCAF. The Consolidated Catalina, or CANSO as it was known in the RCAF, proved to be an effective weapon on both the east and west coasts during the war. Its long range and endurance were badly needed to counter the German submarine menace on the Atlantic. For example, CANSOs flying with 162 Squadron distinguished themselves by sinking 6 U-boats over the course of the war. After the war, the CANSO continued with the RCAF in photo reconnaissance and search and rescue roles up until it was retired in 1962. The Liberator bomber was the most produced American aircraft of the war, with over 18,000 built. In addition to its major bombing role with U.S. forces, it also proved its worth as a convoy patrol and anti-submarine aircraft with many U-boat kills to its credit. The outstanding feature of the B-24 was its range of 2,100 miles and its excellent offensive and defensive armament. Beginning in mid-1943, it became the backbone of the RCAF's battle against German U-boats on the Atlantic. Upon their arrival in England, Canadians traveled to the RCAF's main dispersal point at Bournemouth in the south of England. It had been a popular British tourist resort city prior to the war, but now all the hotels had been taken over by the RCAF to house airmen arriving from Canada. While there, morning parade drills were usually the main order of the day. On at least one occasion, King George and Queen Elizabeth visited Bournemouth to review the RCAF troops. Throughout the war, the royal family played a major role in boosting troop morale. All over England, they made frequent visits to meet and talk with the troops from all of the services. Following a short stay at Bournemouth, Canadian air crews were usually posted to an operational training unit before moving on to a combat squadron. Overseas, the RCAF had 48 squadrons which saw action in all of the major theaters of the war, including Britain, Europe, North Africa, and Southeast Asia. RCAF crews flew in all types of roles, from fighter and reconnaissance to anti-submarine and bombing to transport. Some of the aircraft flown include the Supermarine Spitfire, the Hawker Hurricane, the Douglas A-20 Boston, the North American B-25 Mitchell, the Hadley Page Halifax, and the Avro Lancaster. There are very few people who have not heard of the legendary Spitfire. From the beginning of World War II in 1939, through the Battle of Britain, and onward to the end of the war, the Spitfire gave exemplary service to the RAF and other Commonwealth squadrons. When production ceased in 1948, over 20,000 Spitfires had been built. In the summer skies over Britain in 1940, the Hurricane earned its place in history as the symbol of victory during the Battle of Britain. Always outnumbering its more famous counterpart, the Spitfire, the Hurricane is credited with the destruction of more enemy aircraft during the Battle of Britain than any other aircraft. The original armament consisted of 8 Browning machine guns. However, this was progressively increased throughout the war, with different versions, including 20mm or 40mm cannons, bombs, or rockets. The Douglas A-20 Havoc, or Boston as it was known in RAF and RCAF service, was a twin-engine light bomber used extensively in many theaters throughout the war. Whether flown during the day or as a night intruder, the Boston became known as a rugged, dependable aircraft which was immensely popular with its crews. Many times, Bostons took a great deal of battle damage, yet managed to return to base. With its speed and rugged construction, it was ideally suited to dangerous low-level missions, which were its main forte. The Boston equipped RCAF 418 Squadron from late 1941 to July 1943, when they were replaced by Mosquitoes. Armament consisted of 3 or 4 forward-firing machine guns in the nose and 2 machine guns in the rear gunner's position. Bomb load was usually 4 500-pound bombs. In the North African campaign, a number of squadrons of Bostons saw action with a tactical bomber force. This force was made up of personnel from Britain, Canada, Australia, and South Africa. The aircraft named after Billy Mitchell, an enthusiastic promoter of air power, was built in the greatest numbers of any American twin-engine bomber of World War II. In all, close to 11,000 were produced. The Mitchell fought with every major Allied power and saw action on all fronts. The B-25 was used in many roles, including bomber, reconnaissance, anti-tank, and anti-shipping gunship, as well as a torpedo bomber version. Numerous RAF squadrons operated this aircraft during the war, with many of these aircraft being flown by Canadian crews. The Hadley Page Halifax prototype first flew in October 1939 and started entering service a year later in November 1940. The performance of the early Halifax models was not particularly impressive, but installation of the more powerful Bristol Hercules engines in the Mark III improved performance greatly. The first RCAF squadron to fly the Halifax was number 405, which began in April 1942. With a bomb load of 13,000 pounds, it had a range of over 1,000 miles. The Halifax, along with the Lancaster, was the backbone of the RAF's Bomber Command, though it seldom received the acclaim of the Lancaster. Probably the most famous Allied bomber of World War II was the Avro Lancaster of Bomber Command. It was born out of the failure of the twin-engine Manchester bomber. Avro took the basically sound Manchester airframe and redesigned it to take 4 Rolls-Royce Merlin engines. Like so many good planes, the essence of the Lancaster's success was its simplicity and robust structure. It was also remarkably adaptable, as evidenced by its many roles, such as the famous Dam Buster raid, through to the carrying of the 11-ton Grand Slam bomb. Following the end of the war in 1945, the size of the RCAF shrunk rapidly from its peak of over 70 squadrons, as units were disbanded and personnel returned to Canada. By the summer of 1945, the RCAF's size had been greatly reduced, and the post-war reassessment of its future roles and plans for re-equipping were just beginning. Also, at the end of hostilities, the air show began to slowly return to the skies over Canada. In the early 1950s, the RCAF was well into its rebuilding program. They were also entering an era considered by many to have been the RCAF's golden age. Some of the aircraft of that period included the CF-100 Avro Canuck, the Canadair F-86 Sabre, the de Havilland Vampire, the Canadair North Star, the North American P-51 Mustang, the Lockheed Neptune, the North American B-25 Mitchell, and the Avro Lancaster. In January 1948, the RCAF took delivery of its first operational jet fighter, the de Havilland Vampire. The Vampires were shipped from England to Toronto and assembled by de Havilland. In December of that year, 410 Squadron at Saint-Hubert became Canada's first jet fighter squadron. Armament on the Vampire consisted of 4 20mm cannons, and it had a maximum speed of 531 miles per hour. In total, 85 Vampire 3s were purchased, and they served with the RCAF from 1948 to 1958. In 1953 and 54, the Canadian National Exhibition Air Show featured the Avro jetliner, North America's first jet transport. When it first flew in August of 1949, the jetliner was 10 years ahead of its time, and interest in the aircraft was very high. It had everything going for it. It was fast, at over 500 miles per hour. It was a joy to fly, and its inherent simplicity made maintenance and servicing easy. Numerous U.S. airlines were keenly interested in the jetliner. Even Howard Hughes was prepared to purchase 30 for TWA, but poor political decisions doomed the project. Even with firm orders, the Liberal government refused to allow production of the jetliner, citing the Korean War and the need for Avro to concentrate on the CF-100 production. The jetliner's demise was certainly less dramatic than that of the Avro Aero, but it was no less of a major tragedy in its own right. One thing is for certain. Had the project continued, Avro aircraft would likely have survived after the Aero's cancellation and still be with us today, building aircraft. The CF-100 was Avro Aircraft's only design to ever reach production, and over the next 8 years, 692 aircraft were built. The prototype first flew in January 1950, and it continued in service up until September 1981, when the last remaining Canuck was retired from service. The main armament consisted of an 850 caliber machine gun fuselage pack and two 29 rocket wingtip pods. The 1950s ended on a rather tragic note in Canadian aviation history, with the cancellation and destruction of the Avro Aero by John Diefenbaker's Conservative government. Although the Aero never had the opportunity to perform at an air show in Canada, there were numerous occasions throughout 1958 and into 1959 to see the Aero fly. For the first flight ceremonies on March 25, 1958, over 10,000 people watched Aero number 201 take to the sky. The year 1959 was also the 50th anniversary of powered flight in Canada, but the Aero's cancellation had certainly put a damper on any reason for celebration that year. Even with the Aero's demise at the hands of the Conservative government, 1959 also marked the formation of the Golden Hawks flight demonstration team. For the next 5 years, they performed at air shows across Canada, putting on unforgettable performances. The Golden Hawks were originally formed to celebrate the golden anniversary of powered flight in Canada, and were thus authorized to operate for 1 year only. But because of their overwhelming popularity, it was almost unthinkable to consider disbanding the team. So 1960 began another season for the Golden Hawks, and 4 more years of dazzling aerobatic displays across Canada. Probably the T-33 is best remembered by the Canadian public as the mount of the Red Knight, the aerobatic soloist of the RCAF. He appeared at air shows across Canada from 1958 to 1968. The show consisted of loops and rolls, Cuban 8s, horizontal 360s, inverted flight, and high-speed passes. For those who saw him perform, there was nothing more spectacular than seeing a flame-red T-bird against a clear blue sky. The Ford Trimotor, or Tin Goose as it was often called, first flew in 1926. It combined the high-wing trimotor configuration of the Fokker with the all-metal construction of the Junkers. The plane's maximum speed was 161 miles per hour, with a cruising speed of 123 miles an hour, and a normal range of just over 400 miles. It had seating for 15 passengers and 2 flight crew. Most trimotors served as commercial passenger aircraft, but a number of military versions were also built for the U.S. Army and Navy. This is one of the National Aviation Museum's 3 Avro 504K trainers. The 504 was one of the most widely used training aircraft of World War I, and earlier in the war it was also used in combat roles. The RCAF restored this 504 to flying condition as a project for Centennial Year in 1967. As part of the Centennial celebrations, the RCAF formed a new aerobatic team called the Golden Centenaires, Flying Tutors. During Centennial Year, they performed 100 air displays across Canada. Their schedule had them crisscrossing the country in their gold and blue Tutors, captivating audiences wherever they went. Following their Canadian shows, they also performed at 7 air shows in the United States, before being disbanded at the end of the year. In the early 1970s, as aircraft of the World War II period were becoming more scarce with each passing year, a group of individuals got together to try and preserve what remained. This group and their common interest culminated in the formation of the Canadian Warplane Heritage Museum in 1973. The museum has as its prime objective to obtain, restore, and preserve in flying condition aircraft flown by Canadians during World War II and the Korean War. Through the efforts of hundreds of volunteers, the museum has developed a collection of over 35 aircraft. The Canadian Warplane Heritage Museum takes part in one of North America's great air shows, the Hamilton International Air Show. Each year, Warbirds from World War II fly in from all across Canada and the United States to take part in the Hamilton International Air Show. The show's theme may change from year to year, but the Warbirds always draw great interest. In addition, the latest in military aircraft are also well represented, along with top-notch solo performers and aerobatic teams such as the Snowbirds. The Mosquito was one of the most successful aircraft of World War II, even though it was made almost entirely of wood. Powered by two Rolls-Royce Merlin engines, its lightweight, maneuverability, and high-altitude capabilities enabled it to serve in the reconnaissance role without defensive armament. It also served in the fighter, fighter-bomber, intruder, and bomber roles. Over 7,800 were made, with 1,133 being built in Canada by de Havilland at Downsview. Famous fighting partner of the Spitfire, the Hurricane destroyed more German aircraft in the Battle of Britain than all other British defenses combined. It also fought in more campaigns and war theaters than any other aircraft of World War II. Originally flown on November 6, 1935, the Hurricane entered service in December 1937 with RAF number 111 Squadron. Of the 11,233 Hurricanes produced, only 3 are still in flying condition worldwide. The Canadian Warplane Heritage Museum's Hurricane was one of 1,451 built by Canadian Car and Foundry in Fort William. It is painted in the colors representing an aircraft of number 401 Squadron, Canada's first fighter squadron to enter combat overseas. When production of the legendary Spitfire ceased in 1948, over 20,000 had been built. One of the handful that remained flying, this Mark IX, looks, sounds, and flies as if freshly delivered to the RAF No. 19 Squadron, with which it first served.
For the Royal Air Force Service, the first to carry 8 machine guns, the first to pass 300 miles an hour, and a total of 14,000. World War II. Noel Pemberton Dillon is the founder of the
The Mustang became one of the most famous fighters of World War II. Powered by the Rolls-Royce Packard engine, it was renowned for its capability as a long-range escort fighter and in ground support duties. The most numerous version of the Mustang was the Model D with the bubble canopy. The Canadian Warplane Heritage Museum's Mustang was built in 1944 and saw service in Europe during World War II with the USAF. Following the war, it served with the RCAF Auxiliary Squadron No. 412, starting in 1947. The Grumman Avenger was the standard United States Navy torpedo bomber throughout the war. British Commonwealth forces also flew the Avenger, with over 900 being used by the Royal Navy Fleet Air Arm during the war. A number of Royal Canadian Navy pilots flew the Avenger while attached to the Royal Navy. The Canadian Warplane Heritage Museum's Avenger has been restored to represent the type operated for anti-submarine duties by the Royal Canadian Navy. It was operated from the aircraft carrier HMCS Magnificent from 1951 to 55. Long after its combat career had ended, the Corsair still enjoys a public image as a very successful fighter. Its distinctive inverted gull wing prompts instant recognition, even by those who do not profess to be aircraft enthusiasts. It's credited with destroying 2,140 enemy planes while losing only 189 in combat, thus making it one of the highest-rated combat aircraft of the era. Over 12,500 were built, and it served with the U.S. Navy, U.S. Marine Corps, and the Royal Navy during both World War II and the Korean War. The Canadian Warplane Heritage Museum's Corsair 4 is an FG-1D model built by the Goodyear Tire Company under license. This aircraft is dedicated in honor of Lieutenant R.H. Gray, who was posthumously awarded the Victoria Cross, the Commonwealth's highest honor, for sinking a Japanese destroyer. The North American B-25 Mitchell was used in many roles, including bomber, reconnaissance, anti-tank and anti-shipping gunships, and as a torpedo bomber. Its operational career began in early 1942 in the Pacific, and it was a familiar sight in every theater of the war. It was made famous for its role in the Jimmy Doolittle-led bombing raid on Tokyo in April 1942 by taking off from an aircraft carrier. It was also used by the RCAF after the war as a navigational trainer up until 1963. The Canadian Warplane Heritage Museum's Mitchell is a B-25J that was built in 1945. It has been restored to the configuration of an aircraft from No. 98 Squadron of the RAF to commemorate Flying Officer David Pudney of the RCAF, who earned his Distinguished Flying Cross on Mitchell operations in 1944 to 45. During World War II, the Lancaster shared with its contemporary, the Spitfire, the distinction of becoming a legend in its own time. And since the war, that legend has continued to grow. The Mynarski Memorial Lancaster will continue to foster that legend in the years to come as it tours air shows throughout North America. But more than a legend, the Mynarski Memorial Lancaster has become a flying memorial to the thousands of men and women that came to know her, from the drawing boards and the manufacturing plants to the airfields in Britain and the flak-filled skies over Germany. The first DC-3 flew in 1935, and it became the most versatile and numerous transport aircraft in the world. During World War II, it became the backbone of air transport for all of the Allied forces. Squadrons 435, 436, and 437 of the RCAF flew the Dakotas during the war. Under different designations, over 35,000 aircraft of the DC-3 family were built. The Canadian Warplane Heritage Museum's Goonie Bird wears the colors of RCAF number 436 Squadron, and it was painted with the squadron slogan, Canucks Unlimited, while serving in Burma and India during 1944 to 1945. This particular aircraft was built in 1939 and has the second highest number of hours logged of any type still flying. The McDonnell Douglas Hornet is a highly sophisticated multi-mission fighter. It's equipped with Sidewinder and Sparrow air-to-air missiles, conventional bombs, rockets, and an M16 20mm cannon. During air-to-air combat, its sophisticated radar can track multiple targets, displaying up to 8 on the heads-up display. It's used for NORAD intercepts as well as surveillance and control of Canadian airspace. The operational squadrons are based in Cold Lake, Alberta and Bagotville, Quebec. One of the world's finest tactical fighters, the F-15 Eagle is designed to gain and maintain air superiority in all-weather aerial combat. Utilizing 2 Pratt & Whitney turbofan engines, the F-15C is capable of a Mach 2.5 plus short-period dash speed. It can be armed with Sparrow and Sidewinder missiles and has an internal 20mm Gatling gun. The F-16 Fighting Falcon is a compact, multi-role fighter aircraft designed for air-to-air combat and air-to-ground attack. It has excellent self-defense capability because of its small size and smokeless engine, making it difficult to detect visually or with radar, and hard to hit. Its 360-degree threat warning system and excellent visibility from its bubble canopy reduce the chances that the pilot will be caught off guard. The AV-8 Harrier Advanced Light Attack Vertical or Short Takeoff and Landing Aircraft was originally designed by British Aerospace, and the Model B was built by McDonnell Douglas for the U.S. Marine Corps. All versions are powered by the Rolls-Royce Pegasus 11 engine. 4 nozzles, 2 on each side, can be rotated to full aft position for conventional flight, full down for vertical operations, or moved between the 2 positions for short takeoffs. The ability to rotate these nozzles in flight greatly increases maneuverability. The aircraft's maximum payload is 9,000 pounds, and with maximum ordnance load, the AV-8B Harrier needs less than 1,500 feet of road, field, or runway to take off. It can also land vertically. The Tornado was developed jointly by Britain, Germany, and Italy. The Tornado's advanced all-weather strike capabilities have been proven during thousands of hours of flight development. Its sophisticated high-technology features also give the aircraft a combination of air-to-air and air-to-ground capabilities. These include a variable geometry wing with full-span high-lift devices and a comprehensive integrated avionics system. The Tornado comes in 2 versions. The Interdictor Strike version for service with the German Air Force and Navy, Italian Air Force, and Royal Air Force. The Air Defense variant is for service with only the Royal Air Force. The huge B-52 has remained in service since 1955. Although this is a rather aged aircraft, later versions and extensive modifications have kept it as formidable as ever. The Stratofortress was used extensively in the Vietnam War as a conventional bomber, and most recently in the Gulf War. It has a maximum speed of 595 miles per hour and a range of 10,000 miles. First taken on strength by the RCAF in 1963, the Labrador serves in the search and rescue role on both coasts of Canada and at Trenton, Ontario. In the early 1980s, it had extensive upgrade modifications, including nose radar and new avionics. In spite of its age, the Labrador is recognized as one of the best SAR vehicles used anywhere. It is credited with saving hundreds of lives since its introduction into service. The tracker played an important role in maritime patrols. Characterized by its long range, endurance, and maneuverability, it was in more recent years primarily involved in patrolling Canada's 200-mile territorial waters. Armament could include depth charges, torpedoes, mines, or anti-shipping missiles. The tracker was built by de Havilland under license from Grumman Aircraft during the late 1950s. All have now been retired from active service with the Canadian Armed Forces, but many continue on in flying service as firebombers. Con Air in British Columbia has heavily modified surplus trackers into firebombers called Firecats. The conversion is 3,000 pounds lighter than the standard tracker and has an 800-gallon fire retardant capacity. The Firecat was first introduced in 1978. The Harvard was a version of the AT-6 Texan and became the standard advanced trainer for the British Commonwealth Air Training Plan in Canada and the RAF in England. Throughout the war, it was utilized to train thousands of Commonwealth fighter pilots. In service, the Harvard was universally liked and respected and proved to be the perfect aircraft for making the transition from elementary trainer to high-performance fighter. It was kept on strength with the RCAF as a trainer until 1966. The Martin Mars is still the largest operational flying boat in existence. Two of these flying boats operate from Sprout Lake near Port Alberni on Vancouver Island. They are owned and operated by Forest Industries Flying Tankers Limited and are used as forest fire water bombers. The Mars had its beginning as a U.S. Navy transport and made its first flight in July of 1942. In addition to the prototype, only 5 aircraft were completed before the end of the war, and these entered service in 1946. For 10 years, they operated mainly on the San Francisco to Honolulu route. In 1956, when the 4 remaining aircraft were retired, a consortium of 6 forest industry companies in British Columbia formed Forest Industries Flying Tankers Limited and purchased all 4 aircraft for $100,000. For conversion, a 6,000-gallon plywood water tank was installed in the cargo area, 2 pickup probes underneath, and 4 side dumping doors. With the pickup probes extended, the Mars can take on 6,000 gallons of water in about 20 seconds as it skims a lake surface at 70 miles per hour. A foaming agent is added to the water to provide deep soaking, as well as insulating the trees from the shock of 30 tons of water. Drops are normally made from 150 to 200 feet, and a single drop covers an area of 3 to 4 acres.
Today, so get your cameras ready. There's always folks come up and say, I wish you told me you were going to drop the water. I'm going to take a picture. Okay, well, we're going to get a drop. And folks, here comes one of the largest airplanes still flying in the world today. Probably the world's largest propeller-driven airplane, that's for sure. Turning in towards the field. Gosh, I hope the wind's blowing the other way or we're all going to get wet. What an incredible airplane. And there's the water.
air shows in Canada, like aviation in general, have come a long way in the last 60 years. At the 1932 Kingston Air Show, the RCAF's Siskin, with a top speed of 154 miles per hour, was Canada's frontline fighter. In the 1940s, the British Commonwealth Air Training Plan turned Canada into the world's largest flying school, and was probably Canada's greatest single contribution to the war effort. The RCAF's golden age of the 1950s culminated with the formation of the Golden Hawks aerobatic team at the end of that decade. Then, in the 1970s, the founding of the Canadian Warplane Heritage Museum had a major effect on the preservation of Canadian aviation heritage throughout Canada. Into the 1990s, air shows will continue to entertain, thrill, amuse, and most importantly, educate Canadians about their aviation heritage, both past and into the future.